from Eastern and Western Europe meeting at Dubrovnik. And the title of the discourses that have gone on there have centered around the future of religion. And for the last 4 years, he has organized international courses at Yalta. And the topic of those discourses has been on religion in modern society. Dr. Siebert, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, as we meet today, there is increasing buildup of forces in the Middle East. The rhetoric from the Bush administration increases, and it seems like this administration is determined to send us to war in Iraq. But we also know that there are a large swelling number of opposition voices to this war. We're sitting here behind a sign that is put out by the group in Kalamazoo called Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents to War. And we know that throughout the country there have been demonstrations and organizing going on against this war. Now, one of the groups that has spoken out is the Catholic bishops in the United States. And Father Gregory, Bishop Gregory, who is the head of the Catholic bishops in the United States, sent a letter to President Bush outlining their concerns about this war. And I know that you are very familiar with this letter, and you believe that it is significant. Why is this letter from Bishop Gregory so significant?
Now, that is a very good question. Our society has, of course, become more and more secular. And I think this happens almost daily, if you can see the discussions about Christmas and Hanukkah and so on. And so it seems to me, and I'm very grateful to you that we can have this discourse, that in this more and more secular society, religious voices are somewhat pushed to the fringe and cannot, or have a hard time to have access to public discourse. And so therefore it is beautiful that we can have this discussion today. But I would say that the bishops, when the bishops, for instance, have some scandal at hand, some sexual scandal in the clergy or so, then of course the press comes and they have interviews and so on. But as soon as the bishops' conference talks about poverty or talks about a serious issue like war and peace, then somehow they are not heard. Recently there was some kind of an advertisement, what would Jesus thrive? I think it was very tacky and I'm not for these advertisements. But on the other hand, I'm interested in the reaction. Right away the anchorman would say, well, this concern for gasoline and for trucks and for the environment, that is secular. And it has nothing to do with religion and so on. So that means in a civil society, in a bourgeois society, religion is privatized. It should stay out of the economy, it should stay out of the polity, it should stay out of the family, and one wonders what it still has something to do with. And I mean, in that sense, it kills, it castrates religion in a certain sense. And so for religious people, of course, this dichotomy between the religious and the secular does exist. But for them, the God is also not only the God of the church, but also the God of creation, of the world, and so on. So that seems to be the controversy. And my whole work is that we keep these two sides open toward each other. If it is stem cell research or cloning or whatever, that not the religious side fundamentalistically closes itself up and says, and ghettoizes itself and says we have nothing to do with war and peace or whatever. And that on the other hand, the scientific side or the political side does not close itself up positivistically and laughs about these people when they talk about stem cell things and so on. So this mutual openness. And so therefore, I think if we could do something to give a voice to the bishops who have a voice, but a voice which doesn't come through somehow in this. No anchorman has taken them up since September 13th when that letter was written.
Right. I mean, I did not see this covered in the New York Times. I did not see it in any of the major news. It is as if it didn't exist. So what did Bishop Gregory say? What was the import of his letter? What did he say?
I mean, the bishops, of course, stand in a long succession and a long tradition, and so they used the Catholic natural law teaching. Now, we have long rejected this. We don't even have the bourgeois natural law any longer, and so on. So that produces difficulties in terms of the language, this religious or this philosophical language, and then the political or military science language, and so on. So it is what the bishops base their argument on is the Augustinian 7-point just war theory. Augustine in the 5th century argued against 9 generations of Christians who thought that war was entirely bad. There was no good war. There would be no just war, and so on. So then Augustine somehow accused these 9 generations of Christians that they were Manichaeans who divide up the world into a good empire and a bad empire, and we have a lot of this Manichaean politics too. And this was of course funny because Augustine was of course a Manichaean himself for 9 years and had converted, and now he threw his shadow, so to speak, on 9 generations of Christians, and got the idea that war could be good too. It could be just. One could defend the virgins in Rome against the barbarian tribesmen, our ancestors, who would storm into Rome and rape them, and so on. And so if you once open up and you say, you know, war has also its good sides, then you find a lot. It may stimulate the economy. It may do something for medicine. You have better airplanes, and so on and so on. And so today, every American general would say, war is, of course, a terrible thing, and so on. But, then comes this but. And this is the Augustinian tradition. And Augustine did this after the church, the Augustinian, the Trend turn came, and the church went to bed with the Roman state. And so somehow the church had to open up for the interest of the state. The bishops were moved into the senatorial rank, got the golden sandals and the pluviale, and so now they were cooperating. And part of this cooperation was that now also soldiers could enter the Christian community. So, and since that time, you know, we have this 7-point just war theory. It's a compromise. I mean, it is not the Decalogue, you should not kill. It is not the Sermon on the Mount, who even says to the other, you idiot, or you Hitler, has already killed him in his heart or so. So it is a compromise with society and with the state. And that is where we stand. So far the bishops go, further they do not go. And so the letter is in that sense somewhat careful. I mean, they try to see the president's point of view too. The government of Iraq is not very civilized, and they have attacked Iran, and they have attacked Kuwait, and so on. So they have a bad track record, and the bishops see that too. But the issue is, you know, does what the president wants to do, does it conform to this natural law position? One wants to see that this is really necessary, what has to be done, and so on. And then that certain rules of engagement are also kept up, particularly as far as the civilians are concerned. And so the bishops did this already in the first Gulf War. If we have a second one, that was the first one. And at that time, the bishop who is responsible for the White House went to the father Bush and said, Mr. President, this is an unjust war. And at that time, there was even aggression against Kuwait, so there would be a better point even. But in spite of that, and the president said, well, Bishop, you have your opinion, and I have my opinion. And then he brought Billy Graham in. And of course, Billy Graham underwrote everything. So now Schüler has taken place of Billy Graham. So we have these, as under Constantine, we have these court bishops who then sign on to it. So the church itself may be split, you know, over these issues. So nevertheless, then also 25 churches of the World Council of Churches at that time were against the war.
The first one.
First one, yeah, the first one. So, and now with the second one, we have, of course, the experience of the first one.
Right.
Because the first one also went about these 7 points, just war theory. And one thing was, of course, is always the non-combatants, you see, or what we call collateral damage. And the bishops, you know, were interested in this and talked with the Pentagon. And then they are always assured, you know, that, yes, we will do our best, you know, to keep the collateral damage down. But then there was a rocket sent into a bunker in Baghdad, and 430 children were incinerated. No, I mean, that, you know, this cannot really happen by accident that you get a rocket into a chimney, you know. And then up to 200,000 civilians were killed, mainly in Basra and Baghdad. Now, either, either these people, either the army cannot aim well, and then it wouldn't be a good army, or they aim right, and then it's a criminal activity. And I think there is not much of an alternative to this.
Right. So just to be clear for our audience, the just war theory says if there is going to be such a thing as a just war, then here are the conditions that would make it just.
Right.
Now, Augustine was presenting this when? When was he doing this?
Well, in the 5th century.
In the 5th century.
Right.
So the kind of weapons that they were using in the 5th century are incredibly different from the weapons that we use today. So it raises the whole question of civilian deaths with the kind of weapons that we have today.
Yeah, right. So the evolution of weapon technology, is an important factor in the whole thing. So, I mean, can one, with modern weapons, can one keep civilians out? Or do all wars become what Goebbels said, total wars?
Right.
And I mean, the terror attacks, on German cities and so on, where sometimes 80,000 people in 45 minutes, were killed and so on. Now, they were aimed at, but they were somehow included in the war effort. Because these were workers, from Goethe Street to Schiller Street, they were bombed, and there was no military, but they were workers, and they produced ammunition and so on. So therefore, they were part of it. And when the farmers were strafed in the fields, I was in the German Air Force, I defended those places. And so they were strafed, the farmers produced potatoes, but the army could not march without potatoes. Then you have this total war concept, and it has become more and more, spread everywhere. So that this one point of the 7, would have to be rethought. It has to be modified in modern terms. Now, when they say we have smart missiles, and that's what they do, and we can aim right, only sometimes accidentally and so on. But how can 10,000 civilians in Yugoslavia being killed just accidentally, So somehow in the background, it seems to me, this total war idea, creeps in everywhere, so that there are no non-combatants any longer.
Yeah, and I think that the weapons that they use don't end when they use them. For example, in Iraq now, we know that they used nuclear-tipped ammunition, and that has caused, after 10 years later, the leukemia rate among children in the country is up 300% or more. And that's from weapons that were used 10 years ago. Yeah. So these weapons endure, and those children certainly have nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, right. And the wars don't end anymore in some sense. We have the non-fly zones, and we have, since 10 years, we have bombed them completely and intensified even recently. Recently, even when there is no provocation from the ground, zeroing in on a plane. Yesterday, we bombed something without this provocation. And we cannot go to the UN, because we have no mandate by the UN for this bombing, So therefore, this is another issue now about international law and so on. So, but I have not only such a sign, I will put it up, but I have a peace pole. I put it in the ground because, one war is ended and you get into another one, and some of them even overlap, So Afghanistan is not finished yet, and there is already another one in preparation. And there are 60 Arabic states, where bin Laden could hide, and we may get involved with all of them directly or indirectly. So, I mean, we move more and more to alternative future number 1, a totally militaristic type of society.
Exactly, and particularly when President Bush enunciated his idea of the possibility of preemptive war. Yeah. If we suspect that any other nation would stand against us, then he asserted we have the right to go in and go after that nation. That means endless war. That means total war unending. And the damage to that is just incredible.
And there is a long discourse about this preemptive warfare, you see, because, moral discourses and through the centuries and so on. And it has always been denied. I mean, Hitler did this. Hitler made a preemptive strike against Poland and then against Russia, right? Because he thought Russia will attack us, someday, So he had to attack Poland because he wanted to be directly confronted with the Russian army to be able to surprise them, And then while he still had an anti-aggression pact, he drove in, with the tanks while the coal cars were still going in. So, and that was because the Russians would come in 10 years, But how do we know what somebody will do in 10 years? Today, the Soviet Union does not even exist any longer. So, you know, and also with us in Iraq, I mean, we don't know if this guy will get a heart attack tomorrow.
Right.
We don't know if our we'll have a new constitution in the meantime, new government, new party. Everything is possible. And with him, too, over there. See, so, I mean, in history, nothing is stable forever. Everything, you know, Heraclitus, you cannot go twice into the same river because the river has changed and you have changed. So because of this tremendous, and today the change goes even faster, one cannot possibly say what somebody would say. And so our media say on one side, we don't know what this guy will do, and on the other side, we know what he will do, because that is why we have this preventive war, by the way, the tromming now.
Yeah,
So,
right. Well, one of the Augustinian conditions for a just war is that the good that would come out of it will far outweigh the evil that will be done.
Yeah.
How would that figure into thinking about Iraq?
Yeah, and so there's also the question that it will be successful somehow.
Right.
So somehow the first Gulf War was successful in that sense that Kuwait was restored, you know, was liberated. But otherwise, you know, we wouldn't have that trouble in the last 10 years if it had been successful, you know. But why did we not do what we want to do now 10 years ago? You know, that is an interesting question too, because I think in the background of the administration is that what is called the heartland theory, you know. So, which was developed under Hitler by a professor and his son in Munich. It says that whoever controls the Euphrates and Tigris valleys and so on can then, you know, somehow control the underbelly of Russia and the Mediterranean coast, and the way to India, and the North African coast, and so on. So leave oil out for a moment, you know, the consolidation of oil in Central Asia and in the East, and so on. But politically and military, and Reagan was almost hysterical because he always was frightened that Russia would take that advantage and would move into that heartland, you know. And now the Russians have tremendous investments in Iraq, you know, together with the French, and so on.
Right.
So there is that fear, you know, that somebody else will move into the heartland. And so Hitler, you know, marched to North Africa through Alexandria and wanted to go to Iran, because that is Aryan, that's not Semitic. And then he wanted to go through the Caucasus and wanted to go Iran too. And then he would have had the heartland. And when this didn't work, he put the professor into a concentration camp. What else? He was liberated by us, and then the whole theory and the men were taken to Georgetown University in the Geopolitical Institute. And I think it has influenced American foreign policy in this area, you know, all these years.
So much of this is about control.
Yeah.
I was reading an article, I don't know.
Let me just say something about this, you know. I mean, one thing is it must be successful. There must be a chance of success,
Right.
you know. The other thing is, you know, that you kill the one whom you want to liberate, you know.
Yeah.
So if we want to say we want to liberate, you know, the people in Iraq from this terrible despot, you know, and kill another 200,000 of them. So you're right, there is this issue as well.
So, I mean, how would they define success? That's what I'm confused about. I mean, does success mean removing Saddam Hussein? Does success mean the United States taking control of the region? I mean, well, how do we define
this
success?
is the war goal, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, my cooperation, for instance, in Germany was very ambiguous, because on one side, in the Catholic youth movement, I was taught that the war goals of Hitler were wrong. On the other hand, I saw the Allies, you know, using terroristic methods in order to reach that goal.
Right.
So somehow, according to the just war theory, the goal must be just, but the means must be just as well, you know. So therefore, now what are the goals? And they are vacillating every day,
Right.
you know. I mean, there is an linguistic acrobatics also going on, you know, which confuses anybody who wants to have some kind of a healthy judgment. So sometimes it is the means of mass destruction which are to be removed, and that is why the inspectors are in now, and so on and so on. But sometimes they say Iraq should be disarmed. That's something completely different. They have thousands of tanks from Russia, and they have hundreds of airplanes from France, and so on. I think when they look through these 12,000 pages now, they will all see the industries, you know, in the different countries. And I think some of these countries are in the Security Council. It will somehow be embarrassing, the whole thing. The Germans, for instance, built a bunker for Saddam Hussein, a bunker which could not be even hit by an atomic bomb already for the first war, you know. Not to speak of delivery of gas and so on. The gas which he used against the Kurds and against Iran was delivered by us.
Right.
So see, there is all, but so there are two goals now. But there is a third one that means to take Saddam out. Well, sometimes they talk about this one bullet, but we have a law against assassinating heads of state and so on. But recently an anchorman said, well, that could be changed overnight. The president is stroke of the pen, not thinking that there's an international law against that as well. And what kind of a world would it be like, where every state had the right to take the government out? Somebody doesn't like Bush because he ruins our economy or he gets us involved in all this international stuff. And therefore has the right to take him out or whatever. One always has to think in mutual terms, The golden rule is behind that Bishop letter too. Don't do to Iraq what you don't want them to do to you, or never do to anybody else what you don't want to have done to you, So then, to go in there and take a government out, which by their terms, by their law, is legitimate. Even when Hitler became a dictator, I never knew as a German soldier when the German government became so criminal that I was not bound by my oath. It is very hard, you see, to say this. Should an American soldier, become a conscience objector as soon as he sees civilians being bombed? Where does, governments are so deeply involved in criminality that it's very hard to know when does that delegitimate them, So.
Yeah, I really am deeply concerned about this nation's ignoring international law. When I think about 57 years, we've built up a framework, an international framework of law to try to prevent killing and war, but this nation seems to violate that law with abandon. And I think that's, if you don't have that kind of a structure, what does that do to the world?
And particularly, these are laws, which the bourgeoisie, which is in control here, has themselves developed.
Right.
So, the world would already be a better place if they would hold on to their own laws. I had a discussion with people from the South about prisoners of war. People in the South said how badly their prisoners, of the Confederacy were treated and so on. Well, I was a prisoner of war in Norfolk in the Southern Territory, and I was very well treated because at that time, the American army held on strictly to the convention, the Geneva Convention.
Geneva Convention.
So after and even after there was no German government anymore, the United States still honored the Geneva Convention, and so I wrote to them, I had it better as a prisoner, and why? Because in the meantime the Geneva Convention had been developed. But if we look at the Al Qaeda people now in Cuba, there in these cages,
Right.
And there is the question, are we in a war against terrorism or what? Was that a war in Afghanistan? Then they are prisoners of war, and then they must be treated as prisoners of war. Or they are not treated as prisoners of war, then we are not in a war. If we're not in a war, then they are hostile combatants or something like that, But so in this case, the situation is unbelievably confused.
Right.
Because the government, which is a bourgeois government, holds on to these laws in a certain sense and violates them at the same time, and talks itself out of its obligations, by inventing new words, like hostile combatants. There is no law in the world where there are hostile combatants. They're either prisoners of war because there is a war, or there isn't any war. Then why does one hold them prisoners?
Yeah, I really worry about the example that we set for young people. When we tell them, you must keep the laws, you must keep the rules, and then we violate them at abandon. I think that is a very dangerous kind of a thing. I'm reminded of Dr. King during the 1960s. When the Vietnam War was going on, he was saying, this government tells me, you go out and speak to those young black teenagers and tell them no riots, don't be violent. And yet my country is the most violent country in the world. The same thing now. We tell people, keep in line, keep the system, but then we violate the laws.
And you can see that in the case of McVeigh, for instance.
Right.
McVeigh was in the first Gulf War, and he did not even see what happened to the civilians. He saw how the army was treated in the field, in the desert, And he got the impression that his country had become, his government had become terroristic. And he even wanted to join the Green Berets. He was a patriot, this guy,
Yeah.
And then this was reinforced all the time, this impression that his government became terroristic. And he went to Ruby Ridge, and he saw that wife killed of that right-wing person. And then he went to Waco, and he saw these people, 73 or so, with the children, annihilated. And then 2 years, an anniversary of Waco, he blew that building up.
Oklahoma City.
So, yeah, this is all wrong, but one sees, of course, how the younger generation, looking at all this, how terribly confused they get.
Very much so. and the drumbeat.
Let me say this.
Go ahead.
He, first of all, he behaved very stoically through his trial and so on.
Right.
But then in the sentencing period, he read a letter by a Supreme Judge, where the Supreme Judge says, that the government is the teacher of the people somehow. If the government behaves in that terroristic way, the people have a right to act equally in the same way. And then this almost, satanic thing, he had, in order to hit the FBI officers who had been in Waco, in order to hit them in their office, before that office there was a kindergarten.
Right.
So he killed these children, and then called them collateral damage, which he had learned, from the people in Brussels at that time, who used that word all the time, for these casualties of civilians and so on.
Yes.
Which drove the press nuts, which is a horrible thing, but where did he learn it from, to call this bloody thing of killing civilians their collateral damage, this technical positivistic type of thing? He learned it from his superiors,
Right. And one of the things that strikes me, that at the end of the Second World War, this nation treated its military people very well after the war, with the GI Bill of Rights.
Right, exactly.
And we took care of them, and we recognized the service that they had provided to the country, and we provided for them health care, we provided for them the right to an education. At the end of the Vietnam War, we treated our combatants very, very badly.
Yeah.
And now, at the end of the Gulf War, we did the same thing. I don't think that young people realize the terrible experience that a war is. You had some experience in that. But the wars that we're fighting now with chemical weapons and with all these other radiation things, the consequences endure way longer.
Not only for the former enemy, but also for
our
ourselves,
own soldiers.
Agent Orange and so on. And
Yeah.
there were similar illnesses after the Gulf War
Exactly.
as well.
Still
And they have
going
to be
on.
expected too, in the future.
Right, right. And I look at what it did to that nation and in Iraq, and how the civilians there have paid. They estimate, UNICEF had estimated that 500,000 children had died after the war from the sanctions and the results of the war. So these wars, as we said before, endure and they go on. So I was going to ask you another question about the purpose of this whole thing. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is how we live and how the rest of the world lives.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems that the motivation for all this is to keep it that way, to keep it so that our nation can live in an extraordinarily high quality of life at the expense of other nations. And I see this war as an effort to protect that. Am I off on that, or what?
More concretely, there is this, we say we have to go into Iraq because of freedom and democracy and so on and so on. But the rest of the world, the 180 nations, they all talk about oil,
Right.
So that we go at oil. And the Wiley factor last night, they say, well, there's propaganda. Well, all is propaganda, But it certainly has something to do with oil, the whole thing. That means the consolidation of the oil in Central Asia and in the Near East. And we do need oil, You could even say if we are cut off, from this source, it will become more expensive at the pumps here and so on.
Right.
Somehow you can construct, that it will change our way of life somehow, as we do with El Salvador and so on, If we cannot pay 35 cents to them and we have to pay them more, and then Kellogg, doesn't make so much profit, therefore he cannot pay his workers so well. It touches always on our way of life in a certain sense, But I have a son who is in the, in the travel business, and so he has this account for Exxon, and so there are hundreds and hundreds of Exxon workers who are all traveling in this area to build pipelines and arrange the business and so on. And the Taliban were not willing to have these two pipelines and so on. On the other hand, these pipelines will be eternally vulnerable. I mean, do we want to occupy the whole Central Asia or whatever, you know, in the Near East in order to protect these pipelines forever? There must be another way. You know, the Iranian head of state there, Khatami, you know, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote an article in the Frankfurt newspaper where he wanted if the Americans had only more communicative rationality, we could talk to them. But they have this instrumental rationality, see? All these instruments, all these tools, I mean, tools of production, but also tools of destruction. And that is always in the foreground. But why for a moment, you know, to try, what is this Khatami or this head of Iraq or whatever, what are they really saying, you know? And not right away say, well, they're lying, of course, you know. There's 10,000 pages of lies. You cannot possibly have read them. He knows already,
Right,
you know,
right.
our government knows already that they are all lies and so on. So, see, there is no real discourse going on. And Khatami finally found, you know, one who belongs to the Frankfurt School, Habermas in Frankfurt, who got a Peace Prize.
Yeah.
And then he opened up, you know, that one has the perimeters where these people and we can talk. I mean, because some of them appreciate modernity. They appreciate what we have done, our cars and our electricity and so on. Our constitution, Iran has a French constitution. So they appreciate all that, but they would like to keep their identity,
Right.
their Islamic identity. Now, why in God's name, you know, can we not understand what they are saying? This horrible tragedy, you know, the bombing of the two towers in the Pentagon, that is religious symbolic language. They told us something, you know. They didn't bomb St. Patrick's Cathedral, in spite of the fact that they had a 1,000-year conflict with Roman Catholics. But it was not, that is not their conflict now. It's a conflict between the Muslim world and modernity. And could one not enter a discourse where they would appreciate the greatness of the modern accomplishments in which they participate, particularly weapon technologically? I mean, they change civil airliners into rockets or whatever, you see.
Right.
But they do that modern thing, of course, for a completely pre-modern purpose. And that has to be understood. I think it is not out of the question that we would say, okay, you appreciate us, but we appreciate your identity, you know. And I mean, Bin Laden was in Boston, and he saw what happened to the Islamic students, you know. Nobody destroys their faith, of course, but by learning, you know, instrumental rationality in high finance, in economics and so on, slowly the communicative rational basis for the Quran is removed. I mean, it has happened to the Christians too, and happens to the Jews too. So all three Abrahamic religions should know what modernity can do, and therefore we should enter, you know, with our experience that discourse, and not always push forward these tools of production, let's see, oil production, but particularly these tools of destruction all the time, you know.
Yeah,
there is another side to it, and I think as a nation we have made tremendous sacrifice for this instrumental rationality. Therefore, I'm getting very angry when sometimes these machines are not working in the classroom. I said, here we have sold our soul for that technical stuff, and it doesn't even work, you know.
Right, exactly.
So we are flying in beautiful airplanes, you know, with 1 million inventions in there over 6,000 years or whatever, and our families are falling apart, and our neighborhood falls apart, and our internal inner city cannot be revived very often. So there is something we have sacrificed too much of communicative rationality in order to do these miracles, which we really have done. I mean, whenever I'm in the air, 30,000 feet or whatever, I'm amazed that this thing stands up.
Right,
So, I
exactly,
mean, it stays up most of the time. So, I mean, this, so why should it not be possible, you know, to understand their mainly still religious language, you know? I mean, this Saddam Hussein is a secularized man, you know. Maybe he uses his Muslim religion as a trick. We are doing that in the West for a long time, you know. Functionalized it. Maybe he does. But if Bush says he's born again, who can say that he is not born again? Should we say right away he uses that just as a trick? You know, God bless you, and so on. For a moment where you have at least to accept that he means it, you know. So why does Saddam Hussein, when he is, you know, a socialist and a secularist, and at the same time he still does go through the rituals, you know, kneeling down, praying 5 times or whatever, now let him just stand for a moment, you know. Who knows what's going on in him, you know? He just apologized to Kuwait. Maybe he repents something sometimes. I mean, give him a chance to repent.
So we got to find that common humanity that we could build on.
Yeah, which I would say, this whole discourse thing, not only among groups inside of the country, but also, internationally. I mean, I just ask, why should that not be possible? Now, if we demonize him, there is no discourse. And of course, if we right away have this idea, of inequality, that means, you cannot say this with a golden rule. Of course, we cannot treat him as we want to be treated, because he's not us, he's probably something lower or whatever. See, wherever this inequality, and my whole life long I have suffered from this thing, because I grew up under fascism, and there was this aristocratic law of nature. There must be predators and prey, and you have to see to it that you are not the predator, that you are not the prey, but hopefully the predator. Father Bush, translate this into a liberal, that means neoliberal thing. There must be winners and losers. I mean, on this basis, of course, you cannot have a discourse. You have a strategic discourse. You can have a debate to push him into the corner, to win over him, But you cannot have a discourse where two partners, want to get as close as possible to what the truth may be in this whole thing,
Yeah, why can't we all be winners? Why can't we find that common ground?
This is, you see, that's what the liberals and the fascists have in common. When I say liberals, I mean the neoconservatives and neoliberals and the Roosevelt liberals and so on. They have that in common, that they are convinced that the human species would go under if you don't have winners and losers. And somehow the fascists is the more brutal one, of course, and while the liberal would say we are fighting for freedom and for democracy, the fascist would say I have to go to Romania because I need oil for my tanks, So that means he is in that sense brutally, horribly honest, about the whole thing. So it would help already, if we would say, yes, I mean, we have vital interests for oil, and this is why we are doing it. Of course, nobody wants to die for oil, you see.
No. So
people
you can't
die
say
for
that.
heroic virtues,
Right.
They die for democracy and the highest value, freedom and so on, But then we must be sure that we really mean it. I mean, in Kuwait, we have the same despotic thing as we had before.
Sure.
We restored them again,
Right.
Sometimes that bothers us that people are not democratic, and sometimes we have despots in our pay. And if they don't obey,
Sure.
like Saddam Hussein at a certain point he didn't obey, then, we punish him.
When you talk about highest values, I think about what's going on in the world, and I look at Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, 20 million people now face starvation. We have 70% of the world's AIDS victims are in sub-Saharan Africa. 20 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are HIV positive. And yet that barely gets a nod.
Yeah.
That's not in our vital interest. That's not in our, and it seems to me it definitely is in our vital interest. And yet those kind of values are not even looked at. They're just pushed off the agenda. And it's done with the rhetoric of democracy and freedom. But the reality is that the world is going to run out of oil. And maybe in 50 years. And the greatest deposits of oil are in that region. And so that becomes our vital interest. What happens to the people in Africa, what happens to the people in Central America and Latin America is insignificant in our agenda. So I question the whole agenda. I question about what the nation is supposed to be about. And I think that represents a shift in our nation. I think that we were more idealistic in the past. I look back to the 60s and the 70s, and there were Republican senators and other people like Robert Kennedy who spoke about international values. And it's disappointing to me to look at that.
Yeah. I wonder if it is also a class issue in that sense, that we do not have a real alternative like other countries. We don't have a Labour Party or whatever, So it is two bourgeois parties, even the Democratic Party aims at people who are over 50,000, and the average income of an American is 30,000 or 35,000 and so on. So what are these people, these, to some extent, of course, they think they are middle class, they don't want to be working class, so that plays into the whole thing. But what if this bourgeois ruling class here gets tired or whatever? the workers were never in the process to make laws, not even in the opposition, They kept them out. They looked at football games and so on.
Right.
So if there should be any transition, maybe the bourgeoisie with its liberalism, is exhausted somewhat. And new ideas and so on have to come up. But where is this class, they are on the Lake Michigan fishing or whatever, which are all very worthwhile activities, of course, But I'm afraid, that 180 million people are defranchised in a certain sense. Think of the low participation in elections.
Right.
The last presidents have governed with about 20% of the population, of the electorate.
Yeah.
So that, because the others stay at home, because they think whatever you vote, it will be the same thing or whatever,
Yeah.
So, if we think a little bit deeper, obviously that war stuff and this preoccupation with oil and so on has something to do with a certain class, with a certain mentality, which has created tremendous things, 7076, 7089, Declaration of Civil Rights, it all comes from this class, including the UN and the Security Council, the Geneva Convention. This class has now worked itself out and has become tired and so on. So at least one should think, do you really get a new paradigm, new ideas, new values and so on with the old class,
Right. I think that that the gap between the rich and the poor in our nation is increasing just as it is around the world. And it is not on this nation's agenda to do anything about that. And I think one of the reasons is because the people who are becoming poor, the people who are dropping out of the middle class, as you say, are not represented where the decisions are being made, where our resources are being used. And so we talk about democracy, but our democracy is diminishing enormously. And it becomes a plutocracy where wealth becomes the determining factor.
Yeah. But you see, there is also a trick there, which liberals, in the broad sense now, and fascists have in common, and that is they do not want to change the class system as such. So the inequality remains, but they like to lift the whole system up, so that the people who are poor in Kalamazoo are not so poor as the people in Calcutta. So, and if you lift the whole thing up, no matter how far the distance becomes between the ruling people and the others, they don't have it so bad down there that they would get too angry about it. But how do you pay for this? Well, you pay for this with cheap labor abroad. And so you have the School of the Assassins, which has to terrorize people in El Salvador and Guatemala and so on, all the time, so that they keep their 35 or 50 or whatever cents, so that you have a tremendous amount of surplus value flowing to this country from which you can pay the working class here and put them up a little bit higher, you see. So that means they over there have to bleed. Now, what if you have a conflict over there? If another capitalistic country wants to have the same, that's how the First World War came about. And then the second one, where Hitler then made this thing, well, you Americans, you keep South America, and you British keep India, and French keep Africa and so on. Give me free hand to colonize the East, That was his idea. And so the German workers did almost not pay any taxes, because he took that slave labor from Eastern Europe, and thereby paid for them. And so therefore they followed him. And even when he was dying, they did not make a revolution, the workers, as they had done in 1918, in Hamburg and Munich and so on. So that means he got the working class on his side, in spite of the fact that the distance between Krupp and Thyssen and these people whose employee he was, were quite distant from that working class.
So the way that translates today is we have about 5% of the world's population, and we use about 40% of the world's resources every year. Higher.
Yeah.
And so in order for us to live that way, we have to, as you say, get cheap labor and cheap resources from other countries, so that these people subsidize our way of life. How long can that go on?
Good expression, yeah. It cannot be stabilized forever. Or you have to make more wars. And also inside of the country, that sniper in Washington, he also was in Iraq. He also participated in that war.
He was in the first Gulf War.
And came back, obviously, with the same disturbed type of a thing. And then had family troubles. The courts did not help him. He lost his children and whatever. And so this... that you have, more and more militarization in order to control the quasi-colonies. We don't call them anymore that way. But then you get also, nevertheless, you get pressure inside as well, and you have to introduce the death penalty and so on. I'm always thinking of the Roman Empire, you know, who introduced the death penalty more and more in order to control inside. And finally, there came these Christians, these guys, who didn't care anymore about the death penalty. But even when they were eaten by the lions, you know, it would bring them into eternal life, with eternal happiness, so they didn't care anymore. That means the only weapon which the Roman Empire had to integrate the masses, you know, was losing its teeth. And today you have these guys who want to die.
Right.
I mean, they're standing in line, you know, in the refugees camps where they grew up in the last 50 years. And so you have, if you just have death at home and abroad as the only control, and they don't shy away from it anymore, but welcome it,
then you have
the whole thing loses.
The whole thing loses.
I mean, not only ethically, but also politically, I think this situation cannot be stabilized. So therefore, I would say, you know, naive as it might sound, it is either discourse or it is war. I mean, even in the family, if two partners cannot keep the discourse open among themselves and cannot say, honey, I need more space, or honey, we have to get closer to each other again as we were, and then you go into the death zone of marriage, you see. But if you keep the thing open, you know, the discourse, then the conflicts cannot be avoided. But you have a medium in which you can settle those conflicts. Why does, for instance, when Shatami, you know, writes that he studied in Germany, you know, he studied in the Frankfurt School even, the president of Iran, you know. Why, when he writes a big article there in the Frankfurt newspaper, does the Christian Democratic government not answer it, and the Social Democratic government doesn't answer it? Why doesn't anybody answer when somebody comes who, you know, is somewhat in the middle somewhere, you know? I mean, he's in a lot of trouble with the other fellows there in Iran. But there is an opening. Look, we recognize your great accomplishment, but we worry about our identity. Now, this is a fair state.
Right.
You know? And therefore, you know, when we go back again to take Saddam out or to change a government, I mean, a country is sovereign. We say the UN cannot talk to us because we are a sovereign nation. Now, aren't the others also sovereign nations, you know?
Right. I guess that was what the UN's idea was, that there has to be some place where we can come together and try to create an alternative to war. Otherwise, it's just it's the law of the jungle. And this increased militarization in the world is astounding.
And then there comes this, you know, liberal as well as fascist argument. They babble too long, you know, it's a babbling type of a meeting. They talk too much, you know, we need action and so on, you know. I mean, this attitude of this present government, you know, toward the UN is so extremely ambiguous, you know. I mean, it's very rational and good that the president went to the UN, that he went to the Security Council. But at the same time, there is this propaganda all day long, undermining the authorities of the inspector. This guy doesn't have a degree, and this guy doesn't have a degree. And now it's also the head of them there, whatever his name is, who is suddenly attacked, you know, if he's the right man and so on, you know.
Kofi Annan.
No, not of the UN, but of the inspectors there. What is his name?
Oh yes, I'm forgetting his name.
Okay, but other you know, competent type of a guy. But yesterday they tried to pull him down too, and then they don't go to these places and so on. And we have all this knowledge, and then they don't say what knowledge they have. Well, it's Social Security. We cannot say it.
They're saying we got proof, but we can't give it to you.
A proof which they cannot give to us. That means trust us, you know.
Right. But, you know, they say that. But I read an article in the New York Times yesterday, and in about the 12th paragraph, it says, in background, the American and British authorities admit that they don't have any proof that is like a smoking gun. They don't have that kind of a proof, but they assert it. And so it becomes very difficult to know what the reality is. And that's one of the biggest problems, I think.
And they create the impression for the rest of the world, you know, that no matter what the inspectors will find or not find, they want to have their war in January, because they cannot have it in February because it gets too hot. And if they have to have these suits on against ABC weapons, they cannot walk around the desert with these 100 degrees or whatever heat it is. So the war has to take place before this, you know. And so, but you know, then what I'm so afraid is the isolation, you know. I mean, it's now Israel and Britain and us. I mean, even a powerful state like we are, we do need a broad base of recognition. Napoleon said once, you know, the state of France is so big, it doesn't need any recognition. A few months later, he was in St. Helena or whatever, you know. Even very powerful thing. International right and so on rests on mutual recognition, on reciprocity, you know. And simply Britain, which has simply become an appendix of us, as by the way Hitler predicted, and then Israel. Israel is, of course, an unbelievably important factor in this, you know. Israel
Right, and we
hit
haven't
Iraq
talked
first,
about
you know, with the,
Exactly.
the complex there. And so the whole Israel thing has something to do with the towers, it has something to do with Iraq, and it is a very, very precarious thing.
Right.
you know.
When they talk about fulfilling UN resolutions, they never talk about Israel
Yeah,
and
that's
all the
right.
resolutions
Or the
that
weapons,
they
you know.
or the weapons.
Weapons
We
of
know that Israel has nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so we are very selective in all
Right,
of this.
right.
And this, you know, is dangerous too for the general community of nations, you know.
Yeah, and as we're talking here, I'm thinking to myself, well, there are people that resist. And just this past week, one of the great resistors, Philip Berrigan,
Yeah, right.
died, 79 years old. He had spent a total of about 12 years in prison during his lifetime as a witness against war.
Right, exactly.
And I think he's quite a model for people.
Exactly, and I was a little bit sad when I talked about him among their students. Nobody knew him.
Nobody knew him.
Yeah, in spite of the fact that his children went to K College.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. I
And
knew his
then, of
Jerry.
course, there's Daniel Bergen as well,
Exactly.
you know,
Yep.
with an unbelievable consequence. You know, they lived this whole life in opposition. You know, I mean, Daniel always tells me, you know, whenever he's taken prisoner, you know, they go through these sites, you know, with the rockets and so on, bang with a hammer against the
Yeah,
rockets, and
right.
then pray Our Father and so on.
Yeah.
And then the court procedures, and then the judge would say, well, Father Bergen, say a prayer for us, you know, and then they would put him into prison. I mean, it was with Philip Bergen, it was that way that he went to prison, his wife took care of the 4 children, Sister
Right.
Alistair, former, and then she went to prison and he took care of the children. It's this Plowshare group in Baltimore, you know, they live in the slum area, they live with the poor, they share whatever they have with the poor. It's unbelievable, you know. So when we sometimes are down, you know, because there is so much evil going on, we should not forget, you know, those people.
Yeah.
Or the cardinals, you know, the brother cardinals in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua?
So, yeah.
Right.
Who,
Yeah.
by the way, had this controversy about violence and non-violence. You know, the cardinals thought sometimes violence was necessary, you know, against the Somozas and so on. And the Bergens were strictly didn't want to hear
Totally
of it.
nonviolent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
right,
committed to it.
Extreme
Yeah.
pacifism, yeah.
And I think that's another place where religion plays such an important
Yeah.
part. We've always had our prophets,
Yeah, right.
people who spoke in the name of God.
Exactly,
And
yeah.
they speak about our lives.
Yeah, and the bishops, you know, also speak, of course, in the name of God, you know. I mean, the natural law is an expression of God's will, you know, together with the New Testament and so on. So, and that comes then to that point, what if this war starts? How about conscientious objectors, you know?
Right.
In the meantime, the same church, when I grew up, there was no possibility for a Catholic. They were to be a conscientious objector. So we had 2 Bavarian farmers who objected, and they were both sentenced to death and executed. But the most terrible thing maybe was that the priest who went with them to the execution told them that they were wrong and
Wow.
that the state was right, that they had an obligation to sacrifice themselves for their country, and that they were cowards and so on. And then the Second Vatican Council changed that. So we have practically today in the Roman Catholic Church, you know, 2 possibilities. One is this
Right.
7-point just war theory. The other one is this conscientious objectors, and there you can have a general objection against all wars, or a specific, a selective one. For instance, against this specific
Right.
war. We have that in Israel too, by the way, you know, where there are hundreds of Israeli soldiers who in general would like to defend Israel, but when they are sent into what the others call occupied territories, then they say we don't want to do that. We don't want to women and children.
And
so
their numbers growing. Those
Yeah.
people who refuse
Yeah.
to participate in the West Bank because they say this is occupied territory, this is unjust, what
Yeah.
we're doing here.
Yeah.
Right, so the witness to justice comes in many faiths,
Yeah.
in every faith.
That's right.
And
yeah.
we can find those people.
Exactly, yeah.
I think of a man like Edward Said,
Yeah.
who is a strong Muslim. Who
I mean, we could build something like a world ethos, like in terms of the golden rule. I mean, there is
Right.
almost no world religion which doesn't have the golden rule, you know, the Muslim, the Christian, the Jews, and so on. And Hans Küng, you know, presented that to the UN, the full assembly, you know.
Ah.
And the UN accepted this. And I will take that theme of a world ethos also to the Ukraine and to to Yalta and to Dubrovnik and so on. So that we, so there, I would say, no peace among the nations without peace among religions.
Right.
And there cannot be peace among the religions without discourse among the religions. And there cannot be any discourse among them without knowledge of what they are, what the other is believing. I taught, the Judaism class now, and it was quite a stormy class, but I had a tremendous joy in this. But it is amazing how very often, even Jewish people don't know their own thing. As a matter of fact, when I started, the Jewish students said, "This is not Judaism." I said, "So what in God's name did we do?" But in the end, they knew that we did Judaism. They thought of a little Mickey Mouse Sunday school or whatever, and suddenly, their own religion opened itself up for them. And the other half of the class were Muslims, and they suddenly saw not only what Judaism means, but how much of Judaism is in their own Quran, that the obligations in the Quran, come together with the Decalogue and so on. So, and the Christians suddenly, thought, first of all, I was a heretic because I taught about Judaism. But then finally, they saw that one can have an identity and at the same time be open toward others as well.
Right.
Nobody asked us to give up our modern identity. We couldn't, even if we wanted to, right? But must that prevent us to be open to the identity quest of people who are different from us, So we cannot believe maybe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but why can't we be open to the Jewish people? Or maybe we cannot believe in Allah, and whatever they say about him, but why can't we be open,
Sure.
There is even a bourgeois tradition of tolerance, one of the great accomplishments of the bourgeoisie, which we could actualize in this, Why not be a little bit more tolerant toward people who are different,
Right. People find their own way. People find their own way to God and truth and what is real to them. And
well, they also must find their own way, I mean, to some extent, Islam is stuck still in some kind of a medieval paradigm. And the question is how they get into the modern paradigm. But why couldn't we help them instead of pushing them back all the time, And they will not only have to get into the modern paradigm, they will have to get into the postmodern one, into which Christianity has to find its way too.
Right.
They will not survive if they cannot get into the postmodern one. Because modernity is obviously in a crisis. All what we have discussed are crisis phenomena, which come, when the paradigm comes to its end.
And so at the same time, they don't want to lose their identity. They want to keep all the wonderful things that have made them the people that they are.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a question of
and religion, and if it's taken seriously, the bourgeoisie, never was completely sincere about religion, I mean, already, one of our fathers of the Constitution would say, they should read the Bible, Americans, because then we can govern them better. It's not exactly a religious
right. They become more compliant.
Approach. Yeah, that's right. So, but if somebody is genuinely religious, then he will understand. I mean, he keeps his own identity, but he will understand how serious it is for the other, because that religion tells him where he's coming from and where he's going to, and gives him meaning for his life,
Yeah, because religion is not an escape. It is a way in which we try to transform society into its best, into its highest state.
And when it is functionalized, instrumentalized, made into ideology, false consciousness, then it dies.
Right.
It dies in the process. It becomes phony.
Yeah, I thought that in my time in Central America, the whole liberation theology thrust was moving right along that line, trying to connect people's lives, creating the kingdom here on earth, the kingdom that was to come. And I think, but in our society, I think that the culture that we live in fosters opposite values. It fosters materialism, it fosters consumerism, it fosters individuality versus community, it fosters competitiveness, all the values which isolate us rather than open us up to other people. And I think we pay a great price for that.
That's right. I mean, we have autonomy, and it's beautiful, but solidarity is our weak point. I mean, we do have solidarity, when something terrible happens, a storm or whatever,
Exactly. People are generous.
Yeah, and then you see that we all have that in us, But as soon as the system is restored, then everybody goes in his own house. And so I asked in the post office, I said, why are all these people toward Lake Michigan living, all so far apart? They must hate each other. The post office guy said, no, they don't hate each other, they just don't want to see each other. I said, same thing, you see. So that is all this individualism or whatever. So But you know, we can also, the bourgeoisie here could remember its own revolution, and it would understand a lot of these people, you know. But instead of that, we mix up the language, you know. We call 1989 a revolution. It was not a revolution. It was a counter-revolution. These 12 capitalistic countries marched into Russia in 1920-21. 8,000 Americans are still laying in Murmansk, you know. And so, and then Hitler's thing was a counter-revolutionary. He also said all the time he was a revolutionary. He was a counter-revolutionary, you see. And 1989 was the same thing. So if we could straighten that out, you know, then one would also understand what you just said about the religions, the kingdom or whatever. The bourgeois will say today, well, that's utopian, you know. But the father of the Constitution had a lot of utopia in themselves, you know. They had a dream. Yeah. And if that is completely lost, you know, we are really need a paradigm change.
We definitely do.
Yeah.
Well, I wish we had more. Dr. Siebert, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for watching us this evening.